Deep in the mountains of West Virginia, there is a railway line that no longer exists on any official schedule. The tracks are rusted, the station is boarded up. And every train that once moved through this valley has long since been retired to history. But every single night, at exactly 3 in the morning, something comes through. The ground trembles. The air fills with the groan of iron wheels. A distant horn cries out into the fog. And in the dark, if you look toward the tracks sometimes, just sometimes you can see a faint light moving where nothing should be moving. Investigators have found nothing. Recordings capture only silence. And yet, for decades, residents have reported the exact same thing. Same time, same sounds. Same dread. Tonight, we follow one man who made the mistake that everyone warned him not to make. He went looking for it. Before we begin, where in the world are you watching this? Drop your city, your country, or just your time zone in the comments right now. Are you watching this alone at night? Or are you brave enough to have the lights off? Let us know. Every single comment gets read. We want to know exactly who is out there in the dark with us tonight. Now, settle in, turn the volume up, and whatever you do, don't go looking for it. There is a town in West Virginia that does not appear on most maps anymore. It sits in a narrow valley pressed between two ridges, so tall that in winter, sunlight only touches the ground for a few hours each day. The people who live there, and there are not many of them, are quiet, self-sufficient, and deeply private. They do not talk to strangers about certain things, and the thing they talk about least of all is the railway. The line was built sometime in the early 1900s, carved out of the mountainside to carry coal from the deep mines to the processing yards further west. For decades, trains ran through that valley, regularly heavy, loud, slow-moving giants loaded with black rock. The town grew up around the station, families settled, children were born. Life organized itself around the sound and rhythm of those trains. Then, sometime in the 1970s, the mines began to dry up. One by one, the shafts were sealed, the workforce scattered. And eventually, quietly, the railway company pulled its operations. The last official train ran through that valley on a Thursday in October of 1979. A handful of residents watched it go. Nobody cheered, nobody cried. They simply watched it disappear around the bend in the tracks, and then they went home. The tracks were never removed. There was talk of doing so, some proposal about salvaging the steel, but the funding never came through, and over time, the whole idea was forgotten. The rails just sat there, slowly rusting, slowly being reclaimed by weeds and moss and the long, patient patience of the mountains. And for a while, nothing unusual happened. The first report came in the winter of 1982. A woman named Edna Marsh, who had lived in the valley her entire life, and had no history of mental illness, no reputation for storytelling or exaggeration, called the county sheriff's office at approximately 3:15 in the morning. She was calm when she spoke. She said she had been awakened by a sound she recognized immediately. A train, moving through the valley. She had assumed, at first, that she had been dreaming, but the sound was too clear, too detailed, too physical. She had gone to her window. She had seen a light moving along the tracks below her house. Slow, steady. Moving west, the way the coal trains always used to move, the deputy who took the call was polite. He made a note, he filed it away. He assumed she had been dreaming, or perhaps had heard something else, a truck on the highway maybe, or the wind moving through the ridgeline. He did not go out to investigate that night. But 3 weeks later, another call came. This time from an elderly man named Howard Cassell, who lived on the opposite side of the valley from Edna Marsh. He did not know Edna, they had never spoken. He described the exact same thing. The sound of a train, the light in the fog, the time a few minutes past 3 in the morning. After the third report, the sheriff himself drove out and walked the length of the visible track. He found nothing unusual, no tire marks, no footprints, no evidence of any machinery or equipment. The rails were cold, undisturbed, exactly as they had been for years. He wrote in his report, "No source identified. No further action required." But the reports kept coming. Over the following years, through the 1980s, through the 1990s, and into the 2000s, a pattern emerged that was impossible to dismiss. The reports came from different people, different ages, different backgrounds, different parts of the valley. Some were lifelong residents, some were newcomers, some were passing through, staying at the one small guest house the town still maintained. None of them knew each other before they reported the experience. None of them could have coordinated their stories, and yet every single account described the same sequence of events. It always began around 3 in the morning. First, a low vibration, not quite a sound, more of a feeling, a deep trembling in the floor and walls that woke people from sleep without them knowing why. Then, as the minutes passed, the sound would become audible, a low, distant rumble, the unmistakable grinding rhythm of wheels on rails. Then, louder. Then the horn low and mournful, 2 long blasts, the way the old coal trains used to sound when they approached the crossing near the old mill. And then, if you were standing near a window that faced the tracks, a light, pale, yellowish, slightly diffused by whatever fog was hanging in the valley, moving steadily from east to west, never stopping, never slowing, and then, after a few minutes, it would simply be gone. The sound would fade, the vibration would cease, silence would return. Investigators came eventually. A team from a state university visited the valley in 2007, equipped with audio recording equipment, seismic sensors, and infrared cameras. They spent 3 nights on the hillside overlooking the tracks. On the second night, 2 members of the team heard the sound. They described it later as unmistakable, a full train passing below them, close enough that they could feel the vibration in the ground beneath their feet. One of them claimed he could see a light through the fog. Their equipment recorded nothing. No audio, no seismic activity, no heat signature, no movement. The lead investigator wrote in his published summary, "The witness accounts are consistent and credible. The reported experience appears to be real and shared. The cause remains entirely unknown." The paper was published in a small academic journal. It attracted very little attention. And life in the valley continued as it always had. This is where our story truly begins. His name was Daniel Voss. He was 34 years old, a freelance journalist based out of Pittsburgh, known for writing long-form pieces about forgotten corners of Appalachia, closed mines, abandoned towns, the quiet grief of industrial decline. He had read about the valley and its train in an obscure online forum dedicated to unexplained phenomena, and had initially dismissed it as folklore, small-town ghost story. The kind of thing people passed around to give texture to a place that had been emptied of its original purpose. But then he had tracked down the academic paper. And then the sheriff's reports, which were technically public record, and which he obtained after several weeks of correspondence. And what he found, when he read them all together, was not folklore. What he found was something quieter and stranger and more unsettling than any ghost story. It was consistency. 41 individual reports spanning over 2 decades from people who had no connection to one another, all describing the same sounds in the same sequence at the same time of night, all failing to produce any recordable evidence. All leaving the witness shaken, but certain in the way that people are certain about things they have experienced in their bodies and not just their minds. Daniel drove to the valley on a Friday evening in late November. He had booked a room at the guest house, a converted farmhouse at the edge of town, run by a woman in her 60s named Ruth, who had short silver hair and eyes that seemed to be measuring him from the moment he stepped through the door. She did not ask why he was there. She simply set a bowl of soup in front of him and said, "You're here about the train." It was not a question. He told her he was a journalist. He told her he had read the reports, the academic paper, the sheriff's notes. He said he wanted to understand what was happening. She watched him eat for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "You can understand it from up here. You don't need to go down to the tracks." He smiled politely. He said he might take a walk later, just to get a sense of the geography. She did not return the smile. She said, "People say a lot of things. But the ones who have gone down to the tracks to look, they don't come back the same. Some of them don't come back the way you'd recognize at all." He asked her what she meant by that. She picked up his bowl, even though it was still half full, and carried it to the kitchen. From behind the door, she said, "Sleep well. Breakfast is at 7. He lay in bed that night with his recorder on the nightstand and his notebook open beside him. He had a small flashlight, a good camera, a backup battery for his phone. He told himself he was being sensible. He told himself he was doing his job. At 2:45 in the morning, he got up, he dressed quietly, took his equipment, and stepped out into the cold. The valley was absolutely still. No wind, no animal sounds. The fog was low and thick, pooled in the hollows between the hills, and above it the stars were extraordinarily clear. He could see his breath. He followed the road down toward the tracks. It was perhaps a 10-minute walk from the guest house. The road was unpaved, slightly sloped, and in the cold his footsteps were the only sound, a soft, rhythmic crunch on the frost-hardened ground. He reached the crossing at 2:58. He checked his watch. 2 minutes. He stood there and looked at the tracks. In the moonlight, they were pale and still, 2 long lines of corroded metal disappearing into the fog in both directions. The wooden ties beneath them were dark with age. Weeds grew up between the rails. There was nothing here. There had not been anything here for a very long time. He started his audio recorder. He set his camera to video mode and aimed it down the track toward the east, toward the direction the sound was supposed to come from. And then he waited. At 3:02, he felt it. Not a sound, not yet just a feeling. A deep, low vibration that came up through the soles of his boots and settled in his chest like a second heartbeat. He looked down at the rails. They were trembling. Slightly, almost imperceptibly, but trembling. He could see it in the way the frost crystals on the surface of the metal shifted and shook. He held very still. Then, the sound came. It was distant at first, a low, rolling thunder from somewhere to the east, somewhere in the fog. It grew quickly. The rhythm of it was unmistakable. Wheels on rails, the clatter and groan of a heavy thing in motion, the metallic shriek of something old and massive moving at speed. He could feel the air shifting around him, the way air moves when something large displaces it. He looked at his camera. The screen showed nothing but empty, fog-wrapped track. He looked up from the screen, and it was there, a light, coming toward him from the east. Pale and yellowish, partially diffused by the fog, but very real, very steady, and moving at the speed of a train approaching at full throttle. He could hear it now, deafeningly loud, the full sound of it filling the valley, bouncing off the ridges, reverberating in his skull. The vibration had become a shaking. The ground beneath his feet was shaking. He should have stepped back. Every rational part of him, every trained, professional, skeptical part of him should have stepped back from the tracks. He did not step back. He stood there. He stood there and watched it come. And as it came, as the light grew brighter and the sound grew louder and the ground shook harder, he began to see something beyond the light. Not the engine, not a shape, not anything that could be described precisely, but a darkness at the center of the light, a presence at the heart of it, something that was not the light and was not the fog, but was there nonetheless. And then the horn. 2 long blasts, low and mournful. Closer than he had imagined possible, the sound hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, he fell. He hit the gravel of the crossing and lay there on his back, looking up at the sky. And above him, directly above him, the sound and the light and the shaking passed over him in a roar. So total, so complete, that it seemed to erase everything else, every thought, every memory, every sense of who and where he was. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. And then it was gone. The silence afterward was the loudest thing he had ever heard. He lay there for a long time. He did not know how long. The cold worked its way through his jacket and into his back. Eventually he sat up. The tracks were empty and still. The fog drifted slowly. The stars were where they had always been. He picked up his camera. He looked at the recording. The screen showed nothing but empty, fog-wrapped track. Static on the audio. Silence. He picked up his audio recorder. He pressed play. He heard his own breathing, slow and regular. Then quiet. Then more quiet. Then a soft sound, barely audible, on the very edge of what the microphone could capture, that might have been. If you listened very carefully and were willing to believe what you were hearing, the echo of a horn, 2 long notes, fading, gone. He walked back to the guest house. He did not run. He did not look behind him. He simply walked, one foot in front of the other, up the frost-hardened road, back to the warmth and the light. Ruth was in the kitchen when he returned. She was making tea. She did not say anything about the hour, or about where he had been, or about the state of his jacket. She simply set a cup on the table in front of him and sat down across from him and waited. He stared at the cup for a long time. Then he said, "What is it?" She wrapped her hands around her own cup. She said, "We don't know. Nobody knows." There are people who say it's a memory that the valley itself is remembering the trains that used to run through it, the way an old scar remembers the wound. There are people who say something was left behind when the last real train passed through, something that couldn't let go. There are people who say it's nothing at all, just sound and light from somewhere else, traveling in ways we don't understand. He asked her which of those she believed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I believe that some places hold on to things, and I believe that some things don't want to stop. They just keep going, long after they should have stopped. Long after everything that made them possible is gone." He sat with that for a while, then he asked her what happened to the people who went down to the tracks. The ones who didn't come back the same. She took a long sip of her tea. She said, "They come back. They all come back. But they don't sleep right afterward. Not for a long time. And they get quiet. They stop talking about it not because they have nothing to say, but because the thing they saw or felt or heard, it doesn't translate into words anymore. It's like it lives somewhere the language can't reach." He understood that. He published his article 3 months later. It ran in a magazine known for thoughtful long-form reporting. It described the history, the witness accounts, the investigative failures, and his own experience at the crossing. It was careful and precise and fair. It offered no explanation. It drew no conclusions. In the final paragraph, he wrote only this: "I stood at that crossing and something came through. I cannot tell you what it was. My equipment recorded nothing. My senses told me everything. All I know is that when you stand at the edge of something that cannot be explained and it comes for you anyway, you do not need evidence to know it was real. The knowledge settles somewhere deeper than evidence can reach. It settles in the body, in the bone. It stays there. To this day, the train continues to run. Every night, 3 in the morning. Same sequence, same sounds, same light moving west through the fog. Investigators still come occasionally. They still find nothing. The recordings remain silent. The footage remains empty. And the residents of that small, quiet valley still say what they have always said. If you hear it, and if you are standing somewhere near those tracks on a cold, clear night, and the world goes quiet before 3 in the morning, there is only one thing you need to remember. Don't go looking for it, because it will find you first. And once you have felt it pass through you, once that sound and that light and that presence have moved through the space where you are standing, you will spend the rest of your life wondering if it left something behind when it went, or if it took something with it when it did. Thank you so much for spending this time with us tonight. If this story reached you, if it found you in the quiet hours, in the dark, in that half-awake space between one world and the next, then you are exactly the kind of person we made it for. You can rest now. The sound you heard was only a story. The light in the fog was only words. And whatever was moving through the dark, it has passed. It has moved on. It always does. Close your eyes. Let the silence settle. You are somewhere warm, somewhere safe, somewhere the tracks do not run, and whatever is out there in the valleys, in the fog, and the cold mountain air, it is not looking for you tonight. Sleep well. We will be here when you wake up with another story, another mystery, another voice in the dark that is, after all, just a story, to take with you gently into whatever dream is waiting. Good night, wherever you are. Imagine being frozen solid for 6 hours in -22 degrees. Your body is so stiff that when they try to move you, your skin cracks like ice. Doctors say there's no pulse, no breath, no hope. You're clinically dead. But then, you wake up. This isn't science fiction. This is the true story of Jean Hilliard, a 19-year-old woman who defied every law of medicine and survived the impossible on a frozen December night in 1980. Before we begin, tell me, Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It was December 19th, 1980. The kind of winter night that makes you question why anyone would choose to live in Minnesota. The temperature had plummeted to a bone-chilling -22 degrees Fahrenheit. In the small farming community of Langby, Minnesota, most sensible folks were tucked inside their homes, huddled near wood stoves and fireplaces, waiting for the brutal cold snap to pass. But Jean Hilliard wasn't home. The 19-year-old woman had spent the evening with friends in nearby Foston, about 15 miles from her parents' farm. Jean was the kind of young woman everyone in town knew and loved. She had a bright smile, an infectious laugh, and that genuine warmth that made even strangers feel like old friends. She worked at a nursing home, caring for the elderly with the kind of patience and compassion that seemed beyond her years. As the evening wore on and the temperature continued its deadly descent, Jean decided it was time to head home. She bundled up in her winter coat, climbed into her father's Ford LTD, and started the journey back to the family farm. The roads were treacherous, covered in a thick layer of ice and snow that glistened under the moonlight like broken glass. Jean knew these roads well. She'd driven them hundreds of times. But that night, something went terribly wrong. About 2 miles from her friend Wally Nelson's house, Jean felt the car lurch. The Ford's rear wheels spun uselessly on the ice, and before she could react, the vehicle slid off the road and into a ditch. The engine sputtered and died. She turned the key again and again, but the car refused to start. The cold had already begun seeping through the windows, turning her breath into clouds of white vapor. Jean sat there for a moment, weighing her options. She was wearing cowboy boots, jeans, a light jacket, and mittens. Not nearly enough for a night like this. But she knew Wally's place was close. Just 2 miles. She'd walked farther than that plenty of times. How bad could it be? She had no idea she'd just made a decision that would bring her to the very edge of death. Jean pushed open the car door and stepped out into the night. The cold hit her like a physical force, stealing the breath from her lungs. The wind howled across the open fields, carrying with it tiny needles of ice that stung her exposed face. But she was young, strong, and determined. 2 miles. She could do this. She started walking along the deserted highway, her boots crunching in the snow with each step. The world around her was eerily silent, except for the wind. No cars passed. No lights shone from farmhouses in the distance. Just endless white fields stretching out under a black sky studded with stars that seemed impossibly bright and impossibly cold. The first mile was tough, but manageable. Jean kept her head down, her hands buried in her pockets, thinking about the warm house waiting at the end of this walk. She thought about calling her parents, about a hot cup of coffee, about crawling under thick blankets, and never going out in winter again. But as she continued, something began to change. The cold started to feel different. At first, it had been sharp and biting, making her gasp and shiver. But now, it was becoming almost pleasant. A strange warmth seemed to spread through her body. Her muscles, which had been tensed against the frigid air, began to relax. She felt sleepy, peaceful even. Jean didn't know it, but her body was shutting down. Hypothermia doesn't announce itself with alarms and warning bells. It creeps in quietly, seductively. First comes the shivering, your body's desperate attempt to generate heat. But when your core temperature drops below 95 degrees, the shivering stops. Your blood vessels constrict, pulling warmth away from your extremities to protect your vital organs. Your heart rate slows, your brain starts to malfunction, and perhaps most dangerously, you stop feeling cold. Instead, you feel warm, comfortable. Many hypothermia victims are found with their clothes partially removed because in their confusion, they actually felt too hot. Jean's steps became slower, more labored. Her thoughts grew fuzzy. She knew she needed to keep moving, but her legs felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds each. The lights of Wally's house finally came into view, shimmering in the distance like a mirage. She was so close, just a little farther, but her body had nothing left to give. Just 15 feet from Wally Nelson's front door, Jean Hilliard collapsed face first into the snow. Inside his farmhouse, Wally Nelson was sound asleep, completely unaware that his friend was dying just yards away from his front door. The house was warm and quiet. Outside, Jean lay motionless in the snow, her body temperature plummeting with each passing minute. What happened to Jean over the next 6 hours defies everything we understand about human survival. As she lay in the snow, her body continued to shut down. Her heart rate, already dangerously slow, slowed even further. Her breathing became so shallow it was almost imperceptible. Her blood thickened in her veins as ice crystals began forming in her tissues. The moisture in her skin froze solid, turning her body into something that resembled a statue more than a living human being. Medical science tells us that when your core body temperature drops to 82 degrees Fahrenheit, you lose consciousness. At 75 degrees, you typically die. But Jean's body temperature fell far, far below that. Some estimates put it as low as 64 degrees. At that temperature, every single biological process should have stopped. Her brain should have suffered irreversible damage. Her cells should have ruptured as ice crystals tore through their membranes. Her heart should have stopped entirely. But somehow, impossibly, some tiny spark of life remained. The sun rose on December 20th, 1980. Wally Nelson woke up, made himself some coffee, and prepared to start his morning chores. He had no idea that his day was about to become one he would never forget. As Wally opened his front door to step outside, something caught his eye. There, lying in the snow just 15 feet away, was what looked like a body. For a split second, his brain couldn't process what he was seeing. Then recognition hit him like a punch to the gut. Jean. He ran to her, his boots pounding through the snow. When he reached her, his heart nearly stopped. Jean was lying face down, completely motionless. Her body was frozen solid, not cold, not stiff, frozen, like a piece of meat pulled from a freezer. Wally tried to lift her, and that's when he realized just how dire the situation was. Jean's body was so frozen that when he tried to move her, he could hear her skin cracking. Actual cracking sounds, like ice breaking on a pond. Her face was ashen gray. Her eyes were frozen shut. When he checked for a pulse, he felt nothing. No heartbeat. No breath. No sign of life whatsoever. Most people in that moment would have assumed the worst. Jean was clearly dead. She'd been lying in negative 22-degree weather for hours. No one survives that. No one. But Wally Nelson didn't give up. With strength born of pure desperation, he managed to lift Jean's frozen body and carry her into his house. He laid her on the floor near the fireplace, afraid to put her directly on any furniture for fear that her frozen body might crack or shatter. Yes, shatter. That's how frozen she was. He immediately called for an ambulance, his voice shaking as he tried to explain the situation to the dispatcher. Then he called Jean's parents. That phone call was one of the hardest things he'd ever had to do. "I found Jean," he said. I think she's gone, but the ambulance is coming." The ambulance from Foston Memorial Hospital screamed down the rural roads, its siren cutting through the frigid morning air. Paramedics George Barton and Randy Porter had seen a lot in their careers, but nothing had prepared them for what they were about to encounter. When they arrived at Wally's house and saw Jean, they stood frozen themselves, but for an entirely different reason. They were staring at a medical impossibility. George Barton would later describe her as looking like a piece of meat out of a deep freeze. Her face was a grayish-white color, her eyes were frozen open, staring at nothing. Her body was so rigid that they couldn't bend her arms or legs. Randy checked for vital signs. Nothing. No pulse at the wrist, no pulse at the neck, no heartbeat that he could detect, no respiratory effort. Her skin was so hard and cold that he couldn't even insert an IV needle. The standard protocol in this situation would be to pronounce her dead at the scene. But something made them try anyway. Maybe it was the sheer impossibility of the situation. Maybe it was the desperate hope in Wally's eyes. Maybe it was the knowledge that cold can sometimes preserve rather than destroy. Whatever the reason, they made the decision to transport Jean to the hospital. Moving her was a challenge in itself. Her body wouldn't bend, so they had to carefully position her on the stretcher, treating her almost like a fragile sculpture. Every movement was accompanied by those horrifying cracking sounds as her frozen skin protested. The ambulance raced to Foston Memorial Hospital, with George and Randy working frantically in the back. They covered Jean with blankets, not really sure if it would help, but needing to do something, anything. George later admitted that during that ride, he was certain they were transporting a corpse. He just hoped they could get her to the hospital before her parents arrived. to spare them the trauma of seeing their daughter like this. At the hospital, Dr. George Sather was waiting. He'd received the radio call about a possible hypothermia victim, but nothing could have prepared him for what he saw when they wheeled Jean in. Dr. Sather was a seasoned physician who'd practiced in rural Minnesota for years. He'd treated frostbite, hypothermia, and every winter-related malady imaginable. But he'd never seen anything like this. Jean Hilliard was, by every medical standard he knew, dead. Her skin was so hard he couldn't puncture it with a hypodermic needle. Her body temperature was so low, it didn't even register on a standard thermometer. When he tried to listen to her heart with his stethoscope, he heard nothing. "I can't explain it," Dr. Sather would later tell reporters. But she had to be dead. She was frozen solid. Literally frozen solid. But then Dr. Sather noticed something. Something so faint he almost missed it. When he placed his stethoscope just right, in exactly the right position on her chest, he thought he detected something. Not a heartbeat exactly, but a flutter. The faintest possible rhythm, so slow and irregular that it was almost imperceptible. Maybe one beat every few seconds. Maybe. It was enough. "We're not giving up," Dr. Sather announced to his staff. "Let's warm her up and see what happens." The next few hours were some of the most tense in the hospital's history. The staff worked with a mixture of medical expertise and pure hope, knowing that the odds were overwhelmingly against them. Even if they could somehow restart Jean's body, the damage would be catastrophic. Her brain had been without adequate oxygen for hours. Her cells had been frozen. The tissue damage alone should be fatal. They wrapped her in heating pads and electric blankets, slowly, carefully raising her body temperature. Too fast, and they could cause her blood vessels to expand rapidly, leading to shock or cardiac arrest. Too slow, and they might not be able to revive her at all. It was a delicate balance, and there was no playbook for a case this extreme. Jean's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Hilliard, arrived at the hospital in a state of pure anguish. Wally had tried to prepare them, but how do you prepare parents for the sight of their daughter frozen solid? When they saw Jean lying on that hospital bed, her skin still gray and hard, her eyes frozen in that terrible stare, Mrs. Hilliard collapsed into her husband's arms. The room filled with the sounds of their grief. But Dr. Sather asked them to stay, to talk to her, to pray. He didn't know if it would help, but at this point, they needed more than medicine. They needed a miracle. As the hours passed, something incredible began to happen. First, Jean's skin started to soften. The gray color began to fade, replaced by a hint of pink. The cracking sound stopped. Her limbs, which had been rigid as wood, began to loosen slightly. And then, around noon, nearly 6 hours after Wally had found her, Jean Hilliard took a breath. It was a small breath, barely noticeable, but it was real. Her chest rose and fell on its own. The staff erupted in shocked whispers. Dr. Sather checked her heart rate again. This time, there was no doubt. It was slow, barely 40 beats per minute, but it was there. Strong, steady, impossible, but real. "She's alive," Dr. Sather whispered, and he would later admit that tears came to his eyes. "She's actually alive." But the real shock came later that afternoon when Jean Hilliard opened her eyes. She blinked, slowly, confused, disoriented. Her first words were barely a whisper. "Where am I?" Her mother let out a sob and grabbed her daughter's hand. For the first time in hours, that hand was warm, alive. Jean looked around the room, taking in the faces of her parents, the doctors, the nurses, all staring at her like she was a ghost. Which, in a way, she was. "What happened?" Jean asked, her voice getting stronger. "Why is everyone looking at me like that?" They explained it to her slowly, carefully, the car breaking down. The walk through the cold, collapsing in Wally's yard, being frozen solid for hours, being, by all accounts, dead. Jean didn't believe them at first. It sounded impossible. Surely they were exaggerating. But then she looked at her hands and saw the frostbite. She felt the weakness in her body. She saw the genuine shock and awe in everyone's faces. "I don't remember much," she admitted. "Just walking, being cold, then feeling warm, then nothing." Over the next few days, as Jean continued her recovery, the medical community struggled to understand what had happened. Dr. Sather and his team ran every test they could think of. They checked her brain function, her heart, her kidneys, her liver. They looked for tissue damage, cell death, anything that would explain how she'd survived. The results were stunning. Despite being frozen solid for 6 hours in deadly cold, Jean had suffered remarkably little permanent damage. She had some frostbite on her toes, which was almost laughable given what she'd been through. Some minor frostbite. That was it. No brain damage, no organ failure, no amputations needed. Her heart, which should have been irreparably damaged, was functioning normally. It defied every principle of medicine. When human tissue freezes, ice crystals form inside and between cells. These crystals are like tiny knives, shredding cell membranes and destroying tissue. When you thaw that tissue, the damage becomes apparent. It's why frostbite victims often lose fingers, toes, or worse. Jean should have had massive tissue death throughout her body. She should have been blind from frozen eyeballs. She should have had brain damage from the lack of oxygen. She should have had kidney failure, heart damage, and a dozen other catastrophic problems. She had none of it. Dr. David Plummer, a hypothermia expert who later reviewed Jean's case, called it beyond miraculous. He stated that in his entire career, he'd never seen anyone survive a core body temperature that low, especially for that long. The human body simply isn't designed to freeze and thaw, he explained. When I first heard about this case, I didn't believe it. I thought it was an exaggeration or a mistake in measurement. But the evidence is undeniable. Jean Hilliard survived something that should have been impossible. Theories abounded about why Jean survived. Some doctors suggested that the extreme cold might have actually helped preserve her brain by dramatically slowing her metabolism. In essence, the freezing might have put her into a state similar to suspended animation, protecting her vital organs from damage. Others theorized that her youth and physical fitness gave her an advantage. Still, others admitted they simply had no explanation. The medical journals would later publish papers on Jean's case using terms like unprecedented and unexplained survival. Researchers studied her case, hoping to unlock secrets that might help other hypothermia victims. But in the end, no one could fully explain how Jean Hilliard came back from the dead. Jean spent 49 days in the hospital, though mainly as a precaution. The doctors wanted to monitor her carefully, watching for any delayed complications. But with each passing day, it became clearer that Jean wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Physical therapists helped her regain her strength. Her frostbitten toes healed with minimal scarring. Her cognitive functions remained sharp. She had no memory loss, no personality changes, no physical limitations. It was as if the whole ordeal had never happened, except for the vivid memories and the scars on her toes. The media descended on Foston, Minnesota. This small farming community suddenly found itself at the center of a national story. Reporters from newspapers, magazines, and television shows all wanted to talk to the woman who'd been frozen solid and lived to tell about it. Jean handled the attention with grace, though she admitted it was overwhelming. "I don't feel like a miracle," she told one reporter. "I just feel like Jean. I'm grateful to be alive, grateful to Wally for finding me, grateful to the doctors and paramedics, but I don't fully understand what happened to me. I'm not sure anyone does." Wally Nelson became a local hero, praised for his quick thinking and refusal to give up. He remained humble about it all. "I just did what anyone would do," he insisted. Though privately, he admitted to friends that finding Jean that morning would haunt him forever. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd slept in that day, or gone out a different door. She was so close to my house. So close." Jean's parents struggled with their own trauma. They'd faced every parent's worst nightmare, watching their daughter lie frozen and seemingly lifeless in a hospital bed. Mrs. Hilliard later said that she'd prayed harder than she'd ever prayed in her life. "I made a deal with God," she confessed. "I told him that if he'd just let her live, I'd never complain about anything ever again, and he kept his end of the bargain." Jean's case raised profound questions that scientists and doctors continue to debate decades later. How cold can a human body get and still recover? What's the actual threshold between life and death in extreme cold? And most intriguingly, could Jean's survival teach us something that might save others? Dr. Peter Rosen, an emergency medicine expert, pointed out that Jean's case seemed to suggest that the standard definitions of death might need to be reconsidered in hypothermia cases. There's an old saying in emergency medicine, he explained. You're not dead until you're warm and dead. Jean's case proves that. She had no detectable vital signs, but she wasn't truly dead. Her body was in a state we don't fully understand, somewhere between life and death. Some researchers became interested in the potential applications for medicine. If a human body could survive being frozen, even accidentally, could we learn to freeze people deliberately for medical purposes? Could we put trauma victims into a state of suspended animation to give doctors more time to treat them? Could we use similar techniques for long-term space travel? Jean found these discussions both fascinating and unsettling. It's strange to think that something so terrible that happened to me might help other people someday, she reflected. But if my experience can save even one life, then I guess it wasn't all for nothing. The winter of 1981 brought new anxieties for Jean. Every cold day, every snowfall, brought back memories of that terrible night. She found herself checking weather forecasts obsessively, making sure her car was in perfect condition, telling her friends exactly where she was going and when she'd be back. The trauma was real, even if her body had healed. But Jean was determined not to let fear control her life. She went back to work at the nursing home where her patients welcomed her back with tears and hugs. She continued living in Minnesota, refusing to flee to warmer climates despite well-meaning suggestions from friends. "This is my home," she said firmly. "I'm not letting one bad night chase me away." In the years that followed, Jean Hilliard became a symbol of human resilience and the mysteries of survival. Her story was featured in medical textbooks as the Foston freezing case or the Jean Hilliard phenomenon. Every winter when the temperature dropped, news outlets would revisit her story, reminding people of the dangers of extreme cold and the importance of never giving up on hypothermia victims. Jean eventually married and started a family. She lived a normal, happy life, though she never forgot that night. How could she? She carried a permanent reminder in the form of slight scarring on her toes and in the way her story had become part of medical history. She also became an advocate for cold weather safety. She spoke at schools and community centers, warning people about the dangers of winter weather. "Don't underestimate the cold," she'd tell audiences. "I was young and healthy, and I almost died in less than 2 hours. Always tell someone where you're going. Always keep emergency supplies in your car. Always respect winter." Dr. Sather, who'd supervised her care, remained in touch with Jean over the years. He'd bring medical students to meet her, introducing her as the patient who taught me that miracles can happen in medicine. He'd retired by the late 90s, but Jean's case remained the most remarkable of his career. "I saw a lot in my years as a doctor," he'd say. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the day Jean Hilliard came back to life. The medical community continued to study Jean's case for decades. In the 90s, researchers doing experiments on induced hypothermia for cardiac surgery patients would reference Jean's survival as proof that the human body could tolerate extreme cold under certain circumstances. In the 2000s, as scientists explored the possibility of suspended animation for space travel or emergency medicine, Jean's case would come up again and again. But for Jean herself, the most important legacy wasn't scientific. It was personal. She'd been given a second chance at life, and she was determined to make the most of it. She volunteered in her community, spent time with her family, and lived each day with gratitude. "A lot of people don't get the chance to come back," she'd say. "I did, and I don't intend to waste it." Jean's story teaches us several profound lessons that extend far beyond the medical mystery of her survival. First, it reminds us of the incredible resilience of the human body. We're far more durable and adaptable than we realize. Our bodies have backup systems, fail-safes, and survival mechanisms that we don't fully understand. Jean's body, faced with extreme cold that should have killed her, somehow found a way to preserve itself until help arrived. Second, it shows us the importance of never giving up. Wally could have assumed Jean was dead and not bothered to bring her inside. The paramedics could have pronounced her dead at the scene. Dr. Sather could have decided her case was hopeless. But each person in that chain chose to try, chose to hope, chose to fight. And that made all the difference. Third, Jean's recovery challenges our understanding of the line between life and death. What does it mean to be alive? When Jean was lying frozen in the snow, with no detectable heartbeat or breath, was she alive or dead? Medical technology said dead. But something essential, some spark of life remained. Her case forces us to reconsider our definitions and remain humble about how much we don't know. Finally, Jean's story is a testament to the power of community and care. From Wally finding her, to the paramedics refusing to give up, to Dr. Sather and his team working tirelessly, to her parents never leaving her side, Jean's survival was a collective effort. No one person saved her. Everyone did. Even now, more than 4 decades after that frozen December night in 1980, Jean Hilliard's survival remains one of the most remarkable cases in medical history. Scientists still don't have a complete explanation for how she survived. They can theorize, hypothesize, and study, but the full answer remains elusive. Some people view Jean's survival as a medical miracle, a fortunate alignment of circumstances that allowed her body to enter a protective state. Others see it as a spiritual miracle, a divine intervention that defied the laws of nature. Jean herself has never claimed to know which interpretation is correct. Maybe it's both, she suggests with a smile. Or maybe it's something else entirely. I'm just grateful to be here. What we do know is this. On December 19th, 1980, in the frozen darkness of rural Minnesota, a young woman walked into the night and came closer to death than most of us will ever know. And then, impossibly, miraculously, she came back. Her heart started beating again. Her frozen body thawed. Her eyes opened. And life, which had seemed extinguished, returned. Jean Hilliard's story stands as a testament to the mysteries of life, the limits of human knowledge, and the incredible will to survive that exists within us all. It reminds us that sometimes the impossible happens. Sometimes, against all odds and all logic, life finds a way. And on cold winter nights when the temperature drops and the snow falls, people in Minnesota still tell the story of the woman who froze solid and lived. They tell it as a warning about the dangers of winter. They tell it as a reminder to never give up hope. They tell it as proof that miracles, whether medical or divine, can still happen in our modern world. Jean Hilliard walked into that frozen night as an ordinary young woman. She came back as a living reminder that we live in a world far stranger and more wonderful than we often imagine. Her survival challenges our understanding of life and death, pushes the boundaries of medical science, and gives hope to anyone facing impossible odds. The frozen miracle of Jean Hilliard isn't just a story about survival. It's a story about the resilience of the human spirit, the power of community, and the enduring mystery of life itself. It's a story that reminds us that even in our darkest, coldest moments, hope can survive. And sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible becomes possible. Jean lived a full life after that night, carrying with her the knowledge that she'd been to the edge of death and returned. She knew something most of us will never know, what it's like to die and come back. And in that knowledge, she found a deeper appreciation for every moment, every breath, every heartbeat. Because she knew, better than anyone, how precious and fragile and miraculous life truly is. Jean Hilliard's story has been documented in medical journals, news reports, and has been featured in various television programs about medical mysteries. While the exact details of some aspects of her experience remain subject to interpretation, the core facts of her survival are well established and verified by medical professionals who treated her. Her case continues to be studied by researchers interested in hypothermia, suspended animation, and the limits of human survival. This is a story that transcends the boundaries of science and faith, reminding us all that there are still wonders in this world that we cannot fully explain, and that the human capacity for survival can sometimes exceed even our wildest expectations.
Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there, because time matters on this road. If you like your stories strange, dark, and mysterious, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're headed to a flat slice of America where the sky feels too big and the land doesn't give you much to hold on to western Ohio into eastern Indiana. Cornfields, drainage ditches, a turnpike that runs so straight it feels like a decision you made hours ago and can't take back. Out here, there's an exit people talk about in the way you talk about a bad dream, trying to be casual, failing. By daylight, it isn't there. No ramp, no sign, no merge lane. But after midnight, when the temperature drops and the road hum settles into your bones, a green rectangle appears in your high beams. Exit 41B, white letters. Arrow right. The locals call it Lost Prairie. The map doesn't. Our story follows a woman named Jordan Pike, 30, night shift nurse. Strong stomach, steady hands, the kind of person who can talk a stranger through a panic attack with just a voice and a cup of water. She was coming home from a double at the county hospital, eyes sandy, scrubs smelling like disinfectant and old coffee. It was 2:06 a.m., an hour she knew well. The turnpike was empty except for the occasional semi whispering past like a thought you weren't ready to have. A patch of fog slid across the asphalt. Then another. Jordan turned off the podcast she wasn't hearing anyway. The radio clicked, scanned, found nothing but a weather station murmuring about a temperature inversion and localized ground haze. She cracked her window. Cold air pushed in, heavy with cut hay and something sweeter, like fruit that's 2 days past ripe. The first sign appeared so gradually it felt like it had been there the whole time. Exit 41B, Lost Prairie, 1 mile. Jordan frowned. She knew this stretch. She knew every diner, every billboard for fireworks and fireworks attorneys. She did not know Lost Prairie. It was all fields out there, a fence line, a row of windbreak trees leaning the same way year after year. Half a mile later, another sign. White arrow. Services icons. Gas. Food. Lodging. You don't exist, she said to no one, half laughing at herself. She could have used the gas, though. Quarter tank. Enough. Probably. The next real exit was 12 miles east. She told herself she would pass it. She told herself she was tired, that brains invent things when they're low on glucose and lower on sleep. And then the ramp appeared on the right shoulder, widening, guardrail gleaming, that polite slope down into dark. Jordan signaled because that's who she is. She took the ramp. The turnpike fell away behind her with a long exhale. At the bottom, she met a stop sign that reflected too hard. The letters were too clean, like no bug had ever decided to die there. Ahead, a 2-lane cut east-west. To the right, a gas station glowed white and silent. A small motel squatted beside it. Single story, doors painted that particular tan only motels believe is comforting. A diner with a chrome smile was set back from the road, open, flickering in red, as if someone was pinching the wire. Jordan turned toward the light. The gas station looked like a stage set. Pumps wrapped in plastic that wasn't torn, just loose. The credit card screen on pump 3 displayed a blinking cursor that never advanced. The clerk's area was stocked and empty, the sort of empty that says, "I'll be right back," and then never is. Jordan walked to the door and tried it. Locked. She cupped one hand to the glass and looked in. A handwritten sign leaned against the register, the paper browned at the edges. "Back in 10. Sure," she said softly. She checked her phone. 1 bar, then none. The clock ticked from 2:12 to 2:12. She could have left. Should have. The tank would make 12 miles. The turnpike was a left and a right away. Simple as heartbeat. But the diner's neon winked at her again, and she realized her hands were shaking. Food would fix that. Coffee would fix the rest. The diner door opened on the first push, little bell clearing its throat. Inside, everything wore a thin frosting of time, sugar shakers filmed over, a pie case holding 3 perfect slices that looked printed. The air smelled like warm toast and old pennies. A man stood behind the counter in a white shirt with a name tag that said LYLE in clean block letters. He wasn't young or old. He was the age of a thought you've had too many times. "Kitchen's still hot," he said, like they'd been talking. "Sit wherever." Jordan picked the end of the counter. It felt good to sit. The stool sighed. Lyle poured coffee without asking. The cup steamed like it was trying to say something. "Rough night?" he asked. "Long," she said. "I'm sorry. What town is this?" "I know the turnpike pretty well. Gottly. Lyle smiled a little, like he'd been waiting for the question all night. Lost Prairie, he said. You're safe here. You're... That last part didn't sound like comfort. It sounded like permission. A woman in a corner booth looked up then, hair tied in a scarf, hands around her mug like she was holding a sleeping bird. She had the expression of someone listening to a song only she could hear. Behind her, the motel sign blinked in the window's reflection, and in the blink, its letters rearranged themselves into nothing, just red worms on glass. "What's good?" Jordan asked, because asking normal questions makes reality behave. It usually does. "Grilled cheese," Lyle said. "Tomato soup. Or pie. It's all warm." "Soup," she said. "And do you have quarters?" The motel sign said laundry. "And I need..." She trailed off. She didn't need laundry. She just wanted to ask for the coin. The impulse came the way you sometimes want to pat a dog you don't know. Lyle slid 2 quarters across the counter. They were colder than the coffee mug. "We trade square here," he said. "You can settle up before you go." Jordan picked up 1 quarter. On the obverse, Washington wore a nick across his jaw like a pale scar. She didn't recognize the state on the reverse. The outline looked like a mistake. "Where's everybody?" she asked. "Seems quiet." "Depends when you ask," Lyle said. "You coming off the pike?" "Yeah." Lyle nodded like that meant something. "Road's been hungry," he said. "Fog pulls people sideways. You found the right place to step out of it." The soup came the right red, steam curling, a skin forming and breaking like a memory. Jordan ate. The heat steadied her. Lyle didn't hover. The woman in the booth hummed without opening her mouth. At some point, Jordan realized the coffee didn't cool. It stayed at that first sip temperature no matter how long she let the conversation and the spoon trick the clock. She checked her phone again. 2:12. Again. 2:12. "Can I ask you something weird?" she said. Lyle tipped his head. "How do I get back on the turnpike?" The question sounded too heavy. She felt suddenly stupid for asking it, like asking a lake how to be less wet. "Same way you came," Lyle said. "Left at the light, up the ramp. But don't look at the sign. Let it look at you. And when you merge, don't check your mirrors right away. The road doesn't like to be watched." "Leaving. That's weird," he finished for her. "Yeah." Jordan paid. The quarters clinked against the counter and sounded like they'd dropped too far. She stood. The bell at the door cleared its throat again as she left. Outside, the fog had thickened. Shapes moved in it, not bodies. Exactly. Suggestions. The motel's doors were all closed. In the office window, a TV blued the blinds with a show that had no sound and no cuts. She got in her car. The engine turned like it had been sleeping lighter than she had. At the intersection, the light was red. No cross traffic, no wind, just red, and the fog moving like breath on glass. Jordan waited. The red was not going to turn. When it felt like a dare, she looked down at her lap and counted slowly. 1, 2, 3. When she looked up, the light was green. The ramp rose like a dark throat. The turnpike flowed above, white lines pulsing, semis moving like planets that forgot you. She merged, eyes forward, hands soft on the wheel. For a second, only a second, she almost checked her mirror. That's the moment the urge is strongest, when the danger feels like it's already gone. She kept her eyes ahead. She breathed out. The coffee in her chest finally cooled. 10 miles later, she let herself glance to the right, where the shoulder meets the weeds. No ramp. No sign. A gap in the fence line that might have been anything. The fog thinned. The temperature lifted a degree. The radio found a song she used to love and hadn't heard in years. Her phone woke up and scolded her with notifications. She laughed then, out of nothing but relief. It came out like a hiccup and made her eyes water. At home, she slept like she'd been dropped. When she woke at noon, the quarters were on her kitchen counter where she didn't remember putting them. She picked one up. It wasn't cold anymore. It was room temperature, coin temperature, forgettable. But when she flipped it over, The state outline had decided what it was. Ohio, of course. And yet there, in the outer ring of text, between United and States, a hairline crack that formed a tiny, narrow sliver, like a ramp you only see if you stop trying to. Jordan went back over the next few weeks. In daylight, exit 41B was just nothing. Corn, a fence, the suggestion of a dip where rainwater collected if the wind was right. At night, she avoided that stretch, without deciding to. When coworkers asked why she took the long way home, she said construction, or deer, or boredom. You don't talk about a place like that unless you know the person hearing you won't try to go see it for themselves. People will tell you America is all mapped, that there are no blank spaces left, only smaller and smaller unknowns squeezed into the drainage ditches of the interstate. That's true, mostly. But some exits aren't for everyone. They're for the ones the road would like to keep, just for a minute until the fog decides it's bored of you. If you find yourself out there after midnight, if the green rectangle blooms ahead where there isn't supposed to be anything, if your dashboard clock decides this minute is worth repeating, here's how you pass through. Take the ramp like you meant to. Warm your hands around a coffee that refuses to cool. Pay for something simple with something small. When you go, don't look back too soon. Let the road do the leaving. And later, when you empty your pockets and a coin feels colder than it should, don't throw it out. Some places don't want your fear. They want your manners. And if you ever hear somebody at a truck stop ask where Lost Prairie is, just shake your head and say you haven't seen it in years. Then finish your coffee and go while the light is green.